All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're putting on our historian hats because we're going to dissect this absolutely fascinating paradox surrounding Thelonious Monk. Here is a man who accidentally architected a massive musical revolution, yet at the same time served as a completely reluctant icon during the super turbulent 1960s. We're going to unpack the deep tension between Monk's groundbreaking music, his public persona, and the really intense political movements of the Cold War era.
To set the stage, just listen to this brilliant quote. In 1964, Time magazine put Monk on their cover, practically making him the overnight face of mainstream jazz. But Monk himself was completely bewildered by this. He pointed out, "I was playing the same stuff 20 years ago, man, and nobody was painting any portrait." And he was right. His music hadn't changed at all. He was playing the exact same angular, dissonant style he'd pioneered way back in the 1940s.
So, that brings us to the big question we really have to ask ourselves. How on earth did the most dissonant, confusing jazz musician of the 1940s suddenly become the safe, conservative darling of the 1960s? What you should really take away from this explainer is that sometimes an artist's public image has way less to do with what they're actually playing and literally everything to do with what the broader culture needs them to represent at that exact moment in history.
Section 1, The Paradox of 1964.
Okay, look at this wild reversal of fortune. Back in 1951, Monk's life was incredibly tough. He was falsely arrested for narcotics possession while covering for his friend, Bud Powell. Because of that, he was stripped of his cabaret card, which was basically a police-issued work permit, meaning he was literally banned from playing New York clubs for 6 years. He was living in dire poverty. Fast forward to 1964, the whole shebang has changed. He's on the cover of Time, he's got a massive contract with corporate titan Columbia Records, and he's pulling in $2,000 a week. The music stayed exactly the same, but the world around him completely shifted.
Section 2, The Architecture of Freedom.
To really understand his impact, we have to look at Monk as a sort of musical architect. While other bebop pianists were playing these incredibly fast, dense flurries of notes with their right hand, Monk was heavy. He was deliberate. He weaponized dissonance, intentionally using clashing intervals like tritones and minor ninths. And his rhythm? He was a total master of rhythmic displacement, shifting the beat so it felt kind of stumbling, yet incredibly sophisticated. But maybe most importantly, he wasn't afraid of silence. In an era obsessed with velocity, Monk used extreme space.
And that use of space had a massive ripple effect. By literally stepping away from the piano during performances, Monk forced his bandmates, like the legendary John Coltrane, to experiment completely free of the piano's fixed pitches. As Coltrane himself noted, Monk gave him complete freedom. By creating this extreme space, Monk accidentally provided the exact blueprint for the next generation to just completely break free from traditional chord structures.
Section 3, A Reluctant Musical Mentor.
Now that accidental liberation thrust Monk into a really complicated relationship with the avant-garde. Let's quickly define that. Also known as free jazz, this was a 1960s movement driven by younger artists who took Monk's experiments with dissonance and space to their absolute extremes. We're talking total abandonment of functional harmony and standard time signatures.
But here's where the historical irony is just palpable. These younger musicians were practically worshiping him. Guys like Steve Lacy called him a prophet and literally formed bands just to study his music. But Monk? He wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. He famously dismissed free jazz pioneer Ornette Coleman, bluntly saying, "I don't think it's going to revolutionize jazz." There are even stories of Monk getting so frustrated that he'd loudly slam metal fire doors in the kitchen of the Five Spot Club while the avant-garde guys were on stage playing his tunes.
And this disconnect created a pretty stark financial divide in the industry. The pioneers of this new, radical sound were starving. You had brilliant pianists like Cecil Taylor washing dishes and relying on welfare, while drummer Sonny Murray couldn't even afford a drum set. Meanwhile, the very man they idolized, Monk, was suddenly getting rich playing the exact same music he'd written 20 years prior.
Section 4. Weaponizing the Mad Genius.
So, why was the mainstream establishment suddenly so eager to reward Monk? Well, to understand that, we have to look at the political boiling point of the early 1960s. We were seeing a massive rise in black musicians using their art to protest racism and align with the civil rights movement. And honestly, the establishment was terrified. In '59, Columbia Records refused to release Charles Mingus's protest lyrics. By '62, critics were attacking artists like Abbey Lincoln for bringing African nationalism into jazz. By 1964, things were boiling over with panels on industry racism. The pressure was intense.
Enter Thelonious Monk. In the middle of all this activism, Monk publicly stated,
My music is not a social comment on discrimination or poverty. I haven't done one of these freedom suites, and I don't intend to. As you can imagine, critics, both liberal and conservative, absolutely seized upon this. To them, Monk was the ideal artist because he kept his politics out of his jazz.
Basically, the media weaponized Monk's public apathy. They used it to invalidate the rising tide of black nationalism in the broader jazz community. Conservative critics openly praised Monk for not using his art as a, quote, sledgehammer for political themes. They framed him as this safe, conservative alternative to the angry, radical free jazz movement that was really frightening the establishment at the time.
But they didn't stop there. To further sanitize his image, the press constructed this whole mad genius myth. They took a highly methodical, intensely disciplined composer and reduced him to a quirky, eccentric oddball who just intuitively hit the right notes. They painted him as a naive man-child who didn't even understand his own brilliance. And as historians point out, this was actually a subtle form of racism, denying a black artist their hard-earned intellectual mastery of musical theory and instead chalking their genius up to some kind of uneducated instinct.
Section 5. The Private Radical.
But when we actually pull back the curtain on his life, we uncover a private radical that the mainstream media completely ignored. Behind the scenes, Monk was playing benefit concerts for the blacklisted activist Paul Robeson. He was performing at fundraisers for SNCC, one of the major civil rights organizations of the era, and when a journalist asked him to name the greatest American of the century, he didn't pick some safe politician. He chose the black inventor George Washington Carver. He also harbored a very real, deep-seated resentment toward law enforcement. And honestly, considering he lost his livelihood for 6 years to a false arrest, who could blame him? He spoke out bluntly about police brutality to international journalists, clearly recognizing the systemic targeting of black Americans. This is hardly the voice of a man disconnected from the social realities of his time. So we're left with this massive, profound gap between the Monk that America wanted to consume and the complex, uncompromising man who actually existed. The public myth demanded a safe, apolitical man-child to serve as a conservative alternative to activism. But the private reality? He was a methodical architect of modern music who quietly supported civil rights and fiercely criticized police brutality.
And this is exactly why this matters. It shows the heavy burden of being a cultural icon. Your image can absolutely be hijacked by the culture war, obscuring your actual legacy. In that intense Cold War political climate, Monk's silence and his awkwardness were totally misinterpreted as conservatism, which allowed the establishment to use him as a weapon against the very avant-garde movement his own music had helped create.
So, I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on regarding the incredible genius of Thelonious Monk. Did he stubbornly stand still while the culture eventually moved toward him? Or did his silent defiance secretly pave the way for the very revolution he claimed to ignore? He never compromised. He literally played his wrong notes until the world decided they were right. Thanks for joining me for this explainer today, and keep questioning the myths behind the music.